Harris. Hope I pronounced it well. And I'll just read your profile right away and we'll step into the section. All right. So it says Kate has held progressively senior roles in the human resource industry, and he has worked in the heart mining and now in Teens Challenge Canada. His work has taken him to many different countries and has helped him develop a global perspective on human resource and organization. Kate considers himself fortunate to work at an organization where he helps our clients live full and meaningful life and to honor God. With a standing ovation and a round of applause, I welcome you here on board.
Thank
And
you.
I chose you because of the experience I had with you. You happened to interview me some months ago, and in my entire life, you were the only interviewer that got back to me and told me, Esther, you were not picked because of this certain reason. I'm like, ew, so someone can say this to me, right? Most of the disapproval I get, I don't know the reason why I'm disapproved. While I was entering there, in all fairness, I thought that I had everything that it took or it takes to get that job. So when they come back to me and they tell me I wasn't the chosen candidate, I'm like, what's the reason why? Why is it? Why? But nobody ever tells me that. So once again, I welcome you very well to this section. And I'll just ask you the introductory questions, then we'll pick up questions because we've wasted so much time and we would dive into it. So what I just want to ask to begin the section is what are your short opinion having this global perspective and more particularly in Canada? Do you have on the current developments and especially with the rise of digitalization now? And how do you think this thing is affecting the Canadian labor market today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And as you know, and we talked about at the time, we had many good quality people that we interviewed, and I was thrilled to have been able to speak with you those months ago. And I really appreciated your approach. In the Canadian market, my comment would be the following: is I worked in mining for many years, and digitalization definitely was starting to have some impact in that industry. What we were seeing was labor jobs, so jobs where people were working at the mining face at that time, or in roles that were what we would consider entry to mid-level labor jobs, were starting to be able to be operated through digitalization, so remote work and that type of thing. However, what we didn't experience was fewer jobs, just that people, we were able to, in that environment, mine more tons. So we were more tons for the same number of people. But what was becoming required was we needed people that had pretty strong education. So where in the past, 50 years ago, it might have been people that were working with public school education. Now they might, recently would have been high school. Now they'd be looking at college diplomas and degrees to be able to get and do that, and able to do that work. And so that was specific to the mining industry. And if I can only imagine in other industries that it might be somewhat similar in many industries, where it's not about fewer jobs, it's about more education required to be able to do the jobs, to be able to keep up. And I think that leads to a second point, which is I really believe organizations now, their needs change, and so they make changes in their hiring needs, and that results in people coming and leaving jobs. And so people having flexibility in themselves, building themselves, having flexibility in terms of different education or more specific education, allows that people, us, you, to be able to work in this role for a while, and if something changes, to be able to move on to another role. And so I really believe education is pretty critical to being able to keep up, to be honest. Yeah. Esther, you're on mute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. So what I can hear from what you're trying to say now, which basis from the mining industry, is that education is very important, right?
I think so.
That's
Yes.
what it is. Then can you speak to it in few sentences or majorly why you think education now plays a major role? Because for me in my head, something like mining, I would want to classify it as a vocational skill. And I'm like,
Mhm.
if I can't mine, I can't turn the instrument, or I can't roll something, I should be able to do something. But on a generous perspective, why do you think education, like higher educational qualification, is coming to play a huge role in the labor market as of today?
Well, yeah, so maybe I'll start with mining, and then I'll switch to my current field where I work, and give two quick examples. In mining, in the past, a person might have been underground constructing something, and going into a spot to dig something out. Now what will happen is they're given a machine and they're working up on surface, and they have to drive that machine from a distance, and they have to be able to read and see and understand it. And if there are minor technical computer issues, they have to be able to resolve those on their own. And then if they can't, then a higher end technician would come in and fix it for them, and they would get back to work. Or they might be operating two or three vehicles at once. In the field I'm in now, which is faith-based addiction recovery work, substance abuse recovery work. 30, 40 years ago, 20 years ago, we may have said that, somebody providing addiction recovery was somebody that had, a sound understanding of faith and pushing that. Now what we would say is, no, we need people that understand addiction recovery and are trained in addiction recovery to be able to use the tools available to us in addition to a faith-based approach. Similar, different industries, but a similar story, which is an increase in education in order to deliver our services better or do the jobs better.
Thank you very much. So what I can gain out from all this is education is a leveler, right? Like the more education you have, the better chances you have to put out yourself there and getting the desired job that you want to get, right?
I
So
agree.
let me just
Yeah.
dive into the questions, which I think would anything that strikes the bell to me that I think people might also think the same way. I'll also throw it as we go on with the question. So the first question here is, how do I break into the workforce in Canada? And I feel this question will be coming from an immigrant that is just coming, probably a professional. How best do you think a person can break into the workforce in Canada? Because, and I would say from my own experience, I had a lot of issues when I first settled in getting a Canadian job, and it was popularly said because I never had the Canadian experience, right? So, how do you think someone that's a new immigrant, a professional set to be, can break into the Canadian market or the Canadian workforce?
Well, first of all, it's a great question. And I think we need to acknowledge that it's not easy. So maybe I'll start on the first point. I had the opportunity to work and live in Chile, in South America. And one of the reasons and I also worked in Quebec, in the north part, which was French speaking. And one of the advantages I had in both was I spoke both languages, but I was very fortunate early because I had an instructor who was teaching me French, and she really focused on my pronunciation and how I was speaking, and that really helped me with the language. And sometimes I think it's a challenge for people that are moving to Canada, because Canadians, when we hear the accent, unfortunately, we sometimes make the assumption, that the person can or can't do the job. The reality is we're wrong. The reality is, that people coming in with an accent can do the jobs, but unfortunately, the people making the decision make an assumption: if I can't understand, then they're not going to be able to do the job. While I think that's wrong, I do believe that's a challenge that immigrants would face, and I lived that both when I was moving to Quebec and in Chile. And so I would really encourage that, the first step is, how do I get around this issue of language and accent and stuff, and really encourage. There are some good programs in Canada to help people with their language, but it's not just about vocabulary, but I think it's about comprehension and making sure people can understand. And so one of the tricks that I used to do, and you've done it well today, Esther, is I repeat back, especially when I'm in a second language, I repeat back what I'm hearing to make sure I'm understood and understanding. And the second thing that I would encourage is in that language training, really focus on being understood, because I think that really can help. It's an unfair disadvantage, but I believe it's there from my own experience. I think the second piece in breaking in is I don't know in some countries, but I know in Canada a lot of finding jobs is about networking. So it's not just about the job posting, but it's finding that network to be able to break in. I don't know what the statistics are now, but I know, 20 years ago or whatever, something like 50-60% of jobs were filled based upon connections, not based upon postings. And so finding, for example, when you apply on a job and finding someone to talk to in an organization, or, reaching out to industries and then finding people in that industry and doing the work of connecting with those people and getting their resumes, those things really help. The third thing is, Esther, you now know me. And so, if I was aware of another job somewhere, I may reach out and say, hey, folks, have you considered Esther? Well, those types of connection are gold. Used to use a mining expression, they're very helpful. When I say gold, I mean very helpful in terms of, people finding jobs.
That's spot on. That's spot on. I hear you well, right? So I'll just because of the brevity of time, I would lump some questions together that I feel they are
Great.
related. And this question say, what is the desired or recommended CV template, even if you don't have a Canadian work experience? And how do I ace job interviews?
So I think there are two parts to that, the CV and the format, and then the second part is Canadian experience. So on the CV, I've worked in private sector and then in not-for-profit and charity. I haven't worked in the government sector or school, so that I don't know. But in the private sector, not-for-profit and charity, I would say typically, 1 to 2 page CVs. So sometimes when I worked in South America, it was more typical to have 4, 5, 6 page CVs. I'm not sure in other countries, but in Canada, more typical 1 to 2 page, typically starting with something around a personal mission or what I'm trying to achieve. And then, for more junior people, I would put the education, but always connect the education back to what the job is trying to do. So it's not about the education, it's about how the education connects to the organization, and then experience. And for somebody that's more experienced, like I've got a lot of years of experience, my education would go last, because most people in more senior jobs are not interested in the education. They're more interested in the experience and what you've done. And so I think that's important. And I think the experience is always tied to, what was the situation I was in and how did I help solve the problem, and specifics in that. And my experience has been, in some cultures, people don't want to put I did. And I think I language isn't great. I did. However, in Canada, I think it's very appropriate to express, in a humble way, the things that I did to address or help the organization. I think that's totally okay. As compared to, so a good example, 2 examples might be, a laborer example. So in a construction environment, I worked on a team that constructed, this building, and it was built on time or with no injuries or whatever. And I didn't have any injuries while I was there. That would be, and in a professional environment, if I think about a teacher, I instructed these classes in this school, and we ended up with a very, the graduation rate out of my class was this, or I built a new program that helped us attract new students. So more of a results focus, Esther, I think. What did we contribute? And I think that's always very helpful. On the Canadian experience side, I, I haven't gone through emigrating somewhere, so this is a hard thing for me to experience personally or comment on. But I do believe Canada has changed in that 50 years ago, we would have been less open as a country than we are now to people immigrating to the country. And so I think the Canadian other experience is getting better. But I do think figuring out the way, if you're an engineer, that's probably, you've got to figure out how to make that transition. But I think technician level type roles, it's less about the experience in another country and more about how that experience relates to the job in Canada and making sure you make that translation. So if I'm a water technician in Africa somewhere, making that relate to the industry and being that I'm applying to as a water technician in Canada. Is
Thank
that
you.
helpful?
Yeah,
Yeah,
very, 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 very helpful.
great.
And I can't agree less. Yeah, very, very helpful. For the other part of the question was how to ace job interview. And I
Yeah,
want you to like, I I know you know because of
yeah,
my experience with you.
yeah, yeah,
Um, you mentioned some things that you got back to me about after you interviewed me. So I want you to like from the interviewer's perspective,
right.
what are the necessary qualities away I want you to speak away from like the experiential part, like the experience you need to have for the job, but what are the qualities do job interviewers or job recruiters look at in recruiting the best
Right.
candidate for jobs? Yeah.
So maybe I'll take it from two parts. And the first part is the actual resume and then the interview. So this is a hard reality. Recruiters will often for a job receive anywhere from 30 to 100 applications to thousands. So in a mining context, they would receive 300. So you can imagine if you're recruiting for a role and you've got 300 applications, it's a very quick process. And so typically on a resume, it would take me personally a minute. I would not take more than about a minute to go through a resume. And so what I do is I typically go red, yellow, green. And red is, it doesn't appear to meet it. Yellow is maybe, and green is whatever. And typically if I have 50, to 100 resumes, I'll pare that down to something like 10 or 15 in about half an hour. So so people need to understand that when you're reading that document, like people are looking at it very quickly. And so you really need to make sure if the job says we need somebody that has addiction counseling, it needs to be real clear. I have addiction counselor certification right up front, because if it's hidden somewhere or not clear, you're going to get screened into the yellow or red very quickly. So that's the resume part. It really needs to be clear how you fit the job. And if you don't try to hide it. I would be clear on why you think you'd be fit in your whatever, but acknowledge that you don't have the criteria. Because if you try to hide it, you can imagine it, they're hiding it, it goes to the side. Right? So that's the first piece. In the interview, typically where people can fall apart is now a professional interview in any large organization will typically use what's called behavior-based interviewing, which is they're trying to figure out what have you done in the past to show that you can do the job that I have in the future. And it's typically by examples. And so I'll ask a question of someone, give me an example where, and where people will miss is they won't answer the question. And so once they start to not answer the question, a good interviewer will try to redirect them back. Okay, this is the question. Can you give me examples? And the reason they're looking for the examples is if they can't give examples or good examples, then the likelihood is they haven't done the job in the past, or they don't have examples. So there are, I think, two learnings in that. The first learning is when an interview is asking a question, you have a minute or two, maybe three, to answer the question. So you really need to focus on, and I would say practicing in advance. If you can't answer a question in 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes max, you're probably off track. You need to be able to answer the question directly in a couple of minutes. And I think the second piece is having good examples in advance, so that you can do it in the interview on the spot. So people that start to not be able to answer questions, it's often because they didn't think about it in advance and they get caught. Whereas if you do it in advance, and so maybe I'll take 1 second just to give an example, and then that might be helpful for your audience. I work in human resources. Somebody might ask me the question, when I was in a more junior role, talk to me about a time where you built a method to select people more strongly in the organization. And I would say, okay, I worked in this mining company, and what we did was we went and we built a way to ask questions to figure out how people could demonstrate the ability to work together. And the example was I asked them this question, and then I trained all the managers to do that. And a few years later, we measured and we found through our engagement survey that we actually had a more collaborative workforce, right? So I would be,
In less than a minute.
yeah, and that took me a minute. And that was in an organization with 3,000 people. So in a minute I can do that. And so what I would coach is that, like, in a minute or 2, 3 minutes, you should be able to come up with an example. This was the situation. This is what I did, or what we did, and my part in it. And here was the outcome.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Spot on. Yeah. So at this point, I would ask if you have any resources and you are willing to share before I go to the last part of the questions. I have 2 or 3 more questions before we call it a wrap on this webinar. So I don't know if you have any resources. Like I had you said the behavioral approach.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
don't know if you have any resources that people can read on to like prepare, because I remember me personally too, when I first started interviews, I'm always stuck when it comes to examples, because I never thought in my head that I would be asked practical examples to share.
Right.
I was just maybe thinking I'll be asked theoretical things like define this, say this. But as time grew, I knew that this is what is important, and I knew the reason why they are asking that, like you clearly stated. So I don't know if you have resources that can dive deeper into this so that I can share with people alongside with the replay of this section that would help them to like develop answering question ahead of time, so they don't get stuck when they're asked those questions. I really appreciate it if you send
I
them.
don't, I don't, Esther, but what I'll do is I'll go online and I'll dig around a little bit and I'll send something, because I think it's really important, because good interviewers will do it and will dig. And what I mean by dig is get the examples. When you have weaker interviewers, they actually allow the interview to just go, and they lose time and they just don't select the candidate. And sometimes, that we lose really good candidates because we don't do the work. And so I'll look into that and see what tools, and what I'll do is just send you some links to some examples that I think might be helpful for people. And the second piece is, we actually in Teen Challenge are now looking to hire 2 people actually that have recently immigrated, which is exceptionally cool. We're really excited about that. And one of them is someone that's struggling with a bit of language. And so we're actually reaching out to figure out, and there are 2 things. There's something called the Clark exam, CLARK. I can't remember what the acronym is, but if you look it up, you'll see it. And the second one is LINK, LINK. And both, I believe that they're not just in Calgary. I believe it's a national program. But what it is it's language. And most of major cities, Calgary, Toronto, etc., all have these links to help people with the language side as well if they need it. And so those might be spots that your listeners could reach out to. And any major city would have that. And I would really encourage that. I was very fortunate because I worked in a big organization, so my language training was always paid. But I think getting that is helpful, and a real focus on the pronunciation and clarity stuff could really help, because as much as we don't want Canadians to allow accents to get in the way, I think we do, and that's in some cases. And so I think that helping people with that is important.
Thank you so much for this. Just to like put this thing in context, right? You've said a whole lot, but I want to put it more in context because this question was the major bulk of the questions I received, and I know where it stemmed from. I even have someone on my DM just now. I sent her a job for her to apply, and she's asking me what structure of CV should I look at for, what are the likely questions. I get this every time, right? So I would say, like, for interviewers, what are the like on the spot between like maybe 5 to 10 minutes of your interview? Do you have an idea whether this person is an ideal candidate already? And if the answer is yes, what are those very high quality things? Anytime I'm asking this question, I keep remembering the reason you told me why I wasn't the qualified candidate. I think it had to do with my demeanor on that day, where I was too, you said I picked up later. So I just want to know, like, what are the other things? Because sometimes someone might be very, very qualified for the job, but might not be articulating things very well. So I don't know what are the extra things that you guys look out for, and between 5 to 10 minutes, and you already have an idea if this is a go-to person or something.
Yeah, and so in terms of the what we would call fit, what typically I would be looking for is before we do interviews, we would identify what we would call the competencies for a job. What are the basic skills? You have your education side of it and all of that. So the clear example is an addiction counselor to do addiction counseling. That's the clear example. But the second example part of it would be, what are the competencies, or which are the types of behaviors that we need in a job. And a good example of that would be somebody working in a payroll function typically would need have very good attention to detail. And so for every job, typically a good interviewer will be looking for what are those behaviors or demonstrated skills, not the education, but the demonstrated skills that they're looking for. Another good example would be somebody that's working in investor relations as a field, would need to have exceptional written and spoken communication skills. Okay, so those are the behaviors or the competencies that we're looking for. And every job, good interviewer is looking for that. And so when you go to look for a job, I think it's important to understand in that job, what would they typically be looking for? And then once you have that in your mind, and you can Google that as well, and usually there'll be stuff online to sort of give you a lead into that. Most people know what it is because you've done the jobs where you live now, I'm assuming. So the person that's immigrating has been a payroll person or whatever. And what I would figure out is, what are those skills, and then I would make sure I know what that is, and I would have answers to those questions. So the example being, if I'm going to be working in payroll and I know I need attention to detail, we know that the question is going to be something along the lines of, talk me through a situation where you've had to manage some pretty complicated payroll situations, in an international setting where you've managed payroll between countries and what you did about it. And then they would go through and give the examples. Well, this was the circumstance. I had somebody that was working for us, but they were living in Europe. And so we ended up having to sort out what their payroll was. and we ended up having to manage it, you know. And so that would be the typical example that someone would be able to give to demonstrate, yeah, I've managed complex payroll situations. And so I think that if I go back to your question, what are the typical things? I can't tell you per every situation because every job is different. What I can say is the approach is to say, what skills and behaviors do I need for that role? And then you figure out, you know, how am I going to answer that question for that role to make sure that I can present myself really well in that role.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let me just pick. I have a timer down here, but if in case we just get cut off, please, I might send you another link, right? Just to round up everything. I'm sorry for the stress, please. All right, this question says, I'm a clergyman based in Nigeria at present, but hoping to come here very soon. How can I gain an employment in Canada, right? As a clergy person. And I think you might speak to it since you are working in a faith-based organization. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
for sure. And, you know, particularly if they have other skills, you know, so often, you know, clergy have clergy, and if they have other skills as well, they can link those up. But we're actually just going through this now. There are in the immigration in Canada, I'm not an expert in this, so I would definitely be consulting a lawyer if I needed to, an immigration lawyer. But there are exemptions from doing labor market impact analysis for clergy working in some religious organizations. So if you are doing religious work or working in a religious organization, you can be given exemptions from some of the typical labor markets stuff. So the way you would do that is reach out to the particular organization that you're looking to work with, and then have them work, you know, either you or them work with a lawyer to go through and see if you can apply without some of the requirements of the labor market impact analysis. The reason for that is that analysis can be expensive for the organization or you know, the person immigrating, and so that is a possibility. We're just starting to explore that now in our situation. But one person that we're working with actually was working with a church for many years through that exemption. They were actually working as a clergy in a church, and so they were able to make the application get approved. They didn't have to do the labor market impact analysis, and they worked for that organization for about 7 years as a clergy in the church. And I would say, because of in the church movement, where particularly in the Christian faith, the expansion is happening right now is actually through emigration. It's through immigrants in Canada. And so there, I would think, are many opportunities for clergy to move across and work in faith-based roles, particularly in churches. At this point, I would think that is an opportunity, a space where somebody emigrating to Canada would be able to find work more easily than some other areas.
Thank you so much for that. So I'll take these two last questions. This question says, what's the hot cake job over here? And when they mean hot cake, though, the happening job, right? That's
Right.
easy to go and they will make enough money from it. And based on your experience, what mistake do you think newcomers or new immigrants often make that impacts their employability process or path?
Yeah. So the first one, again, I certainly I would say any getting going where to jobs where Canadians currently don't. And what I mean by that is any northern jobs typically are easier. So, for example, in Ontario, working in Toronto, there's going to be more demand and more competition. Whereas if you go to Sudbury in the north, which is about 4 hours north of Toronto, the reality is there will be more jobs. Now, the challenge with that is there are smaller immigrant networks and communities, so you tend to be more on your own. Plus, those communities, it's only been in the last 10 or 20 years where there's been a real move of immigrants living in those communities. And so there's still, I would say, some level of so I don't want to say intolerance, but I would say there's, not as much understanding of some of the immigrant communities in those spots. So it's a bit more isolated, I would say. But they have jobs. Mining for sure. Mining for sure. There are openings. I know that from my past, for sure. So I would say northern communities, more remote communities, any of those, mining jobs, nursing, for sure. Nursing is one that we're aware of. I know that in a lot, we just continually have needs in any of the service industries. Unfortunately, those jobs are lower paid. But I'm thinking of seniors residents, fast food, that kind of stuff in the big cities. Those jobs, are looking, but like I said, they don't tend to pay as well, and so it tends to be a bit of a harder transition. But once you get into the north, I think there's, for example, if you have professionals that are willing to live in the north, I would think that those would be easier transitions.
All right, so lastly on this webinar, I'll be asking what are the common mistakes based on your experience you think newcomers or generally people that are sourcing for job or employment do make that impact their employability, ability, or process?
One mistake, I think the first piece is I really do believe being direct in the response is quite helpful. So when somebody asks you a question, trying to answer that question fairly directly, it is helpful. The second piece I would suggest is sometimes when we've received applications, people aren't clear around what their status in Canada is. And so we end up digging around, and once you discover that people aren't being clear, it can become something where it's hard. And once it becomes hard, if we have multiple applicants, we would tend to move on to other people. And so I think the first piece, be clear in responses, and second piece is, depending on what your status is, be clear on what that is. Yeah, sometimes organizations will see, okay, it's not what I'm looking for, and they'll move on. But it's actually, I think, better for everybody, because sooner or later, if it's not meeting their needs, they're going to move on anyways. And so I would say those are probably two areas. And I think the third piece is just, I think, being forthright in what your skills and experience are. I think it's good to explain it in a way that puts you in a good light, in a good light. I think that's a good thing. But I think when it starts to become expanded beyond what it really is, that can be a challenge. And a good interviewer will dig through that anyway. And once they start to see that people are expanding, embellishing a bit, I think it's a bit of a problem. And so it's pretty easy now today, particularly with internet. We don't do it where I work, or I don't do it, but it's pretty easy on internet to go figure things out about people. And so once it starts to look like people are expanding really what's happened or embellishing, I think that's not a healthy situation to get into. So I would say those are three areas. And in the workplace, one of the things that I look for is if people have moved jobs, many jobs, many times. So once every 6 months, once every year, once every 2 years, more than a couple of times, without a very good explanation, I start to look for other people. Because typically we want people that are going to spend 3, 5, 10 years working with us. Not all organizations are like that, entry-level jobs, but once you start moving jobs too often, it can become a bit of a sign for people that it's somebody that's not going to stick with them for a while.
Thank you so much. But I'll pick on this because I remembered like most times when I go into interview, when I first started, I'm always a bit nervous, especially when I came into the Canadian system, having
Right.
been like I've not really worked with the Western world people
Yeah,
before, right?
for
So
sure.
I tend to be very short. Sometimes I don't even say things that I've done because I have a lot of accolades, so to speak, right? Like
Right.
so, but there was a time I met with somebody, they're like, you need to say these things. They can be triggers, they can be reasons why you can get the job. So my question
Yeah.
from this part is that where should we draw the curtain, right? Because yes, you are talking of being forthright, which is one of my personal values. I don't think I'll come out and say what I am not, right? But
Right.
where do you think we should draw the line? Because starting for me, when I first started interviews, I would just keep those parts. I'll be like, maybe when I get into the job, they'll figure it out. But I've had some folks come to me and say, you're supposed to bring this thing out. You attend World Bank's issues. You go to on United Nations. You have government awards. You need to bring this thing out to show the stuff you're being made up of, right? But where do you think we can draw that line by not being saying so much and not saying too little when you're on a job interview?
For me, I think it's connecting it to the job that you're looking for. Are we allowed to say hi? Is there a there's a I think there's a young person there with you, Esther. We should say hi. Is this your who are we talking with? Hi. Oh no, having a tear. Uh-oh. Well, we'll say hi. I'm probably holding you back. What's that?
I'll send you a book I wrote for her, a Christian book. It's just
Nice.
about that. I'll send it to you.
Well, tell her that I'm sorry that we're taking you away from
No
her.
worries. No
Yeah.
worries.
Yeah, so to go back to where to cut it off and where to, I think it's first of all, always being mindful that when you're responding to question, you're trying to portray what you're able to do related to the job that's there. And so, um, what's a good example is I think, for example, in your work in the United Nations and what you've done there, that clearly demonstrates that you have an ability to deal with complex issues and to speak in front of pretty smart people. And so I would say that would tell me that if you were applying for a role working with a city, for example, being able to say, working with in front of a mayor or a city council, taking a complex issue and, presenting it to a city council in 10 or 15 minutes or half an hour is something I've done. I haven't, but you have. And so I think it's always connecting it to what's the job the work I've done and how do I connect it to the role that the people are asking me to do. And that's where I think practicing in advance is to say, okay, I know a great example. I used to work in situations where I would be involved in labor negotiations. And I worked in a situation where I was in a country and we were actually speaking with ministers about our negotiations. And so if I were talking with a large company, I would say, I took this situation, we were able to negotiate an agreement, deal with the government because it was important to the government, and come to a resolution within, a few weeks, with no violence. Right. However, if I was dealing with a company in a very small situation, I might say we were able to negotiate an agreement that we treated people fairly, but we reduced our labor costs. You see what I mean? Same situation, but one targeted at the company and one targeted at dealing with a government situation.
Thank you. I hear it loudly, yeah. And that's what I learned over time too, that sometimes you have to go back to the job description, right? And
The
look for
posting.
how all what you've done fits into the process. And that's what I
That's
think
right.
I'm hearing again, right? Thank you
It
so
is.
much.